Not a good look for our profession.
How in the name of common sense did this ever get this far? Vaccines are not seek and destroy missions.
Because he was so severe.
This is nuts.
One of the top 20 things that she has discovered with her research company, Progenobiome, medicine has been corrupted. Where we go from here now, I don't know. Well, it doesn't work.
So angry. Punishable with jail time.
Literally, this makes me believe we live in the Matrix.
Like, deadliest year in U.S. history.
It wasn't a question of if, but when.
If it doesn't work and it's safe, put it in a little Fauci Pez dispenser, give it to the patient, and shut the family up.
It's going to get worse and worse and worse.
Gave Fauci an award for being a hero of the pandemic.
This has been a problem.
These were lies.
Let's talk about the healthcare professionals supporting this.
In the meantime, what was going on behind the scenes,
irony of the whole thing is,
Harvey's 100% correct.
This is freaking annoying.
Ultimately, we need to have hope for America.
What is going on here? What has poisoned your mind? Buckle up, kids. Doctors change lives every day, but what happens when life changes yours? A single injury, a sudden illness, your career, your income, your future can shift in an instant. The best physicians don't just plan for success, they protect it. At Set for Life Insurance, they believe financial security isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. True own occupation disability insurance ensures that no matter what happens, your future stays in your hands. Because protecting your income means protecting everything you've built. Visit drpodcastnetwork.co/set4life today. Secure your future before life makes the choice for you.
Welcome back, everyone, to the BS Free MD podcast with your hosts, Doctors Tim and May Hindmarsh, where we like to get to the really heart of the medical conversations that are mattering to you. And today we have a guest who has been at the center of one of the most controversial discussions in medicine over the past few years, Dr. Pierre Kory. He is known as a critical care physician, a former chief of the critical care service at the University of Wisconsin, and the co-founder of the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, or FLCCC. As many of you know it. He's been a vocal advocate for alternative treatments for COVID-19, and his views on vaccines and pandemic response have sparked both praise and intense debate. So today we're diving into his journey, as well as his stance on vaccines and the challenges he's faced along the way and some of his big aha moments. So, let's just leave it at that. Yeah. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. Good to finally meet you in person and have you on.
Totally. It's good to be here. Talked to a couple other docs who lived through COVID, and we all have our journeys, our experiences.
Well, we sure do. And it's fascinating because this will be released tomorrow on March 13th. But today that we're recording, March 12th, is the 5-year anniversary of when they basically shut the world down. And I know exactly where I was. I mean, this was like the JFK assassination or the space shuttle blowing up or 9/11 or whatever you use, a reference point based on your age. We were going to go to a rock show with our friends. They canceled the show while I was at work. They sent us home early. And then the night got fuzzy because we drank absinthe and played music in my buddy's studio till like 2 in the morning. So that was the beginning of this for me. And at that point, May and I, we were 100% in lockstep with the CDC said it. If Fauci said it, we're like, absolutely shut the world down for a couple of weeks. Let's figure this out. We don't know what it is. Coincidentally, we had just listened, going back and forth, commuting to work, the book, The Great Influenza.
We were 3/4 of the way through listening to the Audible. Wow. And we were like, holy shit, it's the 100-year. Here we go again. Like, we saw it. And
so this is kind of all primed in our mind. And then it happens. And, it was really, really interesting. And then, I started doing more research. And by the time, and I'm not just a dopey country doctor, by the time we got to about the middle of April, I was like, I think you got to let everyone that can get sick and not die get sick and not die.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be the most efficient way to sort through this and then figure out the vaccine stuff and whatever. So anyways, where were you 5 years ago? And kind of guide us through your evolution of like, what in the world?
Wow. So I was the chief of the critical care service and the head of the main medical surgical ICU at the University of Wisconsin at the time. So I was a clinical leader. And as a clinical leader in the middle of Wisconsin, the way those cities got hit and the way COVID kind of showed up, it was really delayed because I'm from New York. I was trained in New York. I ran an ICU in Southern Manhattan for almost 10 years. And man, I was on the phone every day with my old colleagues. I mean, I knew everybody who ran an ICU in New York. Either I was trained by them, I trained them, or trained alongside them. And so like I was just getting like frontline information. And I will tell you though, I remember just working so hard for the hospital because we had like this FEMA. We had a surgeon who was like been with FEMA for 10 years and he had all these skills on disaster planning. And we were coming up with these insanely complex schedules of like different lines of staff because we were assuming, 40% of the staff would be out or some would die. We didn't know what was going on. We had all of these contingency plans to make sure that all the units were staffed. I was running around kind of repurposing units or preparing for COVID patients where like we were making holes in the wall so the ventilator tubing could come out so we could put the vents in the hallway so we wouldn't have to, the nurses wouldn't have to go in and out, gowning and gloving. I remember practicing gowning and gloving and, all like paranoid and just, it was so much work, but we were getting ready. And then slowly the hit came. We never really got a massive surge, just kind of trickled in, and then it hit some peaks, but, yeah. And then I had a falling out with Wisconsin pretty quickly. I mean, I ran into trouble pretty quickly because I was calling bullshit from the beginning. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Like I was the clinical leader and I remember I was running we suddenly had daily briefings and I was in charge because, it was ICU patients who come to the hospital that were going to go to probably the ICU. And, it was people on Zoom or on phones, and then all the house staff were there. So it was like fellows, residents, and then all the attendings, and then the hospitalists. And so I was just updating everyday people on policy and all these things. But as we started to treat these patients, like I wanted to hit them with steroids and blood thinners. I mean, we were seeing clots in the ventilator tubing. Like, the dialysis nurses, like these patients are clotting like nobody's business. I was working with the hematologist. We were doing what's called TEG scans. And you're seeing these crazy graphs on the TEG scans, like no fibrinolysis. So we knew that they were so sick hematologically. I mean, it was just a no-brainer that that first wave, that clotting became less. Like variants changed. I saw clinical differences with the variants, but that first wave in the ICU was wicked. And so I started to, say, hey, we should put some of these patients on blood thinners. In fact, we started doing TPA in a couple of really sick people because they were so sick. And then when I started getting steroids, but then I started having my superiors come over the top on me. So now they started attending the briefings. And then I remember my chief was like, one day he didn't shout because he's a very nice man, but he was like, we need to follow the guidelines. And I'm sitting there like, guidelines? What is he talking about? And he pointed out the American Thoracic Society guidelines. And I was like, oh, I must have missed that one. And so I pulled the paper and the guidelines was a survey to 100 academic intensivists. And it had 6 questions, like steroids, yes, no, blood thinners, yes, no, just some basic clinical decision points around these patients. And I remember, this is my paraphrasing, but it was 40, 40, 20, right? So it was 40 yes, 40% said yes to the whatever therapy proposed, 40% said no, and then 20% were undecided. That was the guidelines. And I was like, there's no, they're basically saying do not. And so you know how that was interpreted is do nothing. Not practice medicine as you see fit, as you think the patient needs, as your skill, your expertise level would support. And I'm an aggressive guy, and I knew steroids at this point was not going to hurt them. They were absolutely dying for steroids. And then, if you guys know, I gave a testimony in May of 2020 saying that there was a critical need for steroids in the hospital. And I did that when every national and international organization was against it. I got a ton of grief from University of Wisconsin. They were pissed. That I was talking publicly and people accusing me of malpractice. And lo and behold, corticosteroids in the hospitalized patient became standard of care like 3 or 4 months later. And so, I was up in arms. And then remember the stay home till the lips turn blue? I mean, absolutely absurd.
And what other field of medicine, like we said this before, would you tell someone who's got, say, a UTI, stay home till you're septic with a high fever and like Rigers, don't come in until you're ready to be admitted to ICU? It's just exactly.
My partner, Paul Marek, he said it so well in the beginning. He said, there is no disease you cannot treat. Right. And they were pretending like, they did such a dim, superficial, it's a viral syndrome. It'll resolve on its own. It's like, it was a viral syndrome 5 days ago. We have a critically ill, like really inflamed lung right now. We got clotting issues. I mean, this is not someone with the sniffles and a bad cough and a fever, and so it was absolutely absurd. It was absurd.
I want to jump back for a minute. So, because I know a lot of people are going to wonder this, and some of our audience is non-medical, but the big thing of who's making the decision making. So you're, in charge of the ICU, but who are your superiors? Were they medical physicians, or were they white white coats?
No,
blue
these
coats,
were both. So at the time, my chief was a pulmonary and critical care specialist like myself, as well as the chair of medicine was also pulmonary and critical care specialist. And they were advocating for supportive care only. And they would come into these meetings and they had this view that anything that we did was experimenting. There's no evidence to support, that whole thing, like no evidence to support what you do. You want me to sit around, watch these people die on ventilators while I'm waiting for the evidence? And that was
were they seeing patients? Were they seeing patients? Were they seeing patients?
No.
At the desk.
They were not on the front lines. And because I remember one guy was presenting like a case, and when that boss heard that he put him on steroids, why'd you put him on steroids? Why'd you put him on steroids? You're going to make things worse. And then I remember my chair writing the most unfortunate email, because that will not age well. I should have kept it, but it was like, she just went off, there's no role for anticoagulants, steroids are overused in the ICU. They've never shown to have any benefit, like just she was not a good clinician. And so almost everything she said not to do actually turned out to have evidence to support it and was actually the correct thing to do. And so it was but that fight broke out all over the country. Mm-hmm. Every hospital, every ICU fighting on steroids. And what I hated about it is the infectious disease doctors were given such a voice. Like these guys are the genius who's going to get out of it. I was like, infectious disease doctors. I mean, all they know is to be scared of steroids. They have completely misplaced fear of steroids. And so they're getting, because it's an infectious disease, of course, it's naturally they would be the experts, which you guys can still see the anger. I was like, they're experts at nothing. At telling me what antibiotic to put on. They don't know how to manage a multi-organ failure patient. It was so beyond absurd. But I remember those fights breaking out. Fights.
So that was early.
Fights. Yeah, that was early. And then I went to. And then I had. This is kind of an interesting aspect, but I'm an expert. You mentioned it before. I'm an expert in intravenous vitamin C and sepsis. That's how I connected with Paul Marek, and I'd been doing research on that. And when I sat on the therapeutics committee of the hospital, come up with our hospital protocol, and we all were in charge of researching different therapies that were being considered, hydroxychloroquine and, one of the VIRs, what else? Corticosteroids, anticoagulation. And I put forth all the evidence for high-dose intravenous vitamin C in lung injury, in ARDS, and in viral syndromes. And that actually met the support of the committee, even though, yes, there was some, and we actually voted to put IV vitamin C on the University of Wisconsin's protocol. And this is where my first trouble came into. So this is a group of clinical experts, some ID docs, a couple of critical care docs, and some, I can't remember who was on. It was like 5 or 6 of us. And we all decided that evidence met sufficient safety and probably likely efficacy. So it was on our official protocol. And I even had them starting it on the floors outside the ICU if they hit, if they came in on a certain amount of oxygen, because we had to have some sort of protocol. Anyway, when then I formed the FLCCC right around that same time with Paul Marek, and we got a little bit of press. I did an interview, and apparently the dean of the medical school saw this interview. And I talked about how IV vitamin C was on the protocol and that I thought it would likely save lives and prevent, the need for mechanical ventilation. And apparently he lost his mind because my boss went after me. And then what happened was, I would call it academic misconduct. The chair, I think the dean was just like, get the vitamins off the protocol, right? Because that's not serious. You can't be like one of the top academic medical centers using a vitamin, right? By the way, he was a psychiatrist. And so what happened is I got to watch academic misconduct because the chair reconvened the therapeutics committee, threw her weight around, and I listened to the discussion, and suddenly the same discussion of the evidence that we'd had 2 weeks prior, suddenly everyone is anti-vitamin C. And I didn't attend because I knew what was going to happen, and I just wanted to stay out of it. And so after that happened, after I saw she did that, I resigned. And I said, I'm gone. And then I went and I fought on the front lines. I went to New York because at that time I email every day. The societies, the critical care societies are, big bolded emails, intensivists needed in New York now. And I'm from New York. Like, I wanted to go back to my old hospital. My family's there. And so I actually resigned and I asked for what I called a humanitarian leave. And I took off. I left and then I worked for a month in New York, and that was wicked. What I inherited is I inherited a unit of patients who'd been on ventilators for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, just dead lungs, and couldn't recover them, and it was nasty. Anyway, we could talk about other stuff. Otherwise, I could talk clinical medicine with you guys. I don't know if I can get in a podcast with doctors, so it's like you're bringing out the doctor in me.
Perfect.
The thing that's so fascinating, like when I'm listening to, you said all of this broke out at the same time, basically in every major hospital across the country. And even, the smaller hospitals when we were still in Oregon was it was the same kind of, it was protocol. And you think, how much more innovative could we have been if it wasn't protocol? If all of the people just used common sense, if all these physicians said, look, we don't know what this is really, we don't know how it's going to work, but this is what we're seeing. We're seeing blood clots. We got to treat that with blood thinners. We're seeing it's hyper-inflammatory, so we got to use the best anti-inflammatories we have, which of course are steroids. Like it's just using common sense, and it reminds
like sharing knowledge.
Right.
I'm thinking of Dr. Sabine Hazen, a friend of ours who, she's experimenting on her patients, checking their gut microbiome, what she's using protocol. I mean, the sharing of ideas amongst clinicians on the front lines could have been revolutionary and life-saving to so many people.
That was happening. So one of my colleagues on my service, he was an intensivist, he started this WhatsApp group. I think we must have had 40 or 50 doctors from around the country on it. It was like really very vibrant, really dynamic group. And we're sharing preprint papers, and everyone's giving their experiences. And and then like on Facebook, you were hearing stuff like the first evidence for steroids were like the hospitals that actually put steroids in their protocol. They were not using steroids and then started to, like, there were people doctors going out on social media, like, we are seeing turnarounds. We're seeing people's oxygen levels, oxygen requirements go down. They're coming off of ventilators. I mean, that's how you respond in an emergency. You exchange information, you learn these clinical experiences. And, the one other thing that, and this is kind of, I don't want to sound like self-congratulatory, but another thing that happened, I remember, because this is a big issue for a lot of people, is that early intubation thing. So when that first came up, so this is like probably our first week of COVID patients, and some COVID patient kind of crashed on the floor, had to be intubated in the middle of the night. And suddenly I had like 4 or 5 anesthesiologists on my critical care service who came to me, and they were like, I think we should start intubating when they hit at about 6 liters nasal cannula. And I was like, oh, no, we're not doing that. And that was weird because I think that was fear. There was also rumors going around that these patients were capable of suddenly crashing. And I was like, this is an inflammatory lung disease. I don't know about that sudden crashing. I was like, I don't think that's like a dynamic. And I was hearing from my colleagues in New York that they weren't suddenly crashing. But they were all scared. I also think it's that whole infection worry, like everyone's at risk. If you put them on a ventilator, it's a closed circuit, right? So there's no exposure to the healthcare personnel. But I made a strong argument that day in one of those briefings. I said, we are not changing our approach to deciding when to put someone on a ventilator. We're going to do it on the same thing we've always done, which is based on the work of breathing. If your assessment is that this patient can't maintain that level of work, then they need a mechanical ventilator. You do not use oxygen levels. And that took months for this country to figure out, because by the summer, you started seeing everyone was okay with using high-flow nasal cannulas. And so you had patients on 100% oxygen, comfortable in chairs, and you didn't need to intubate them. But I will tell you, I ended early intubation before it even started at University of Wisconsin. But I'll tell you, I don't think that happened everywhere. It took them a while to figure that out. And so I think a lot of people got intubated that probably may not have required it in the end. And so we're unfortunately, the ventilators, I think, did hurt people. But I use, it's interesting. I teach, that's a part of what I've always taught, like students and residents and fellows, is when to decide to put someone on ventilator. So it was like a topic that I was deeply interested in, because the answer is you put them on not too early and not too late. Right. Which is really challenging. And that decision is in the eye of the beholder. And I used to, when I trained fellows, in my mind, I'd be like, yeah, he's an early intubator. I'd have a couple of fellows like that had way more intubations than anyone else. And I was like, he pulls the trigger a little fast, and I was by nature a very late intubator, to the point, like, because after every time you decide to put someone on a ventilator, you kind of always debrief in your mind, like, did I do it too early? So I was always doing self-assessments, and generally my conclusion as I reviewed that decision was like, yeah, I probably should have done it a couple hours ago, or, they probably was screaming the need, and I was just trying to turn them around, Anyway, so that was another thing I remember.
There was tons and tons, like the standard of care for a while was these people were intubated in the ER.
Yes.
I talked to, I mean, it was crazy. Like, you talk to ER doctors and they're talking about how horrible this was because they're having a discussion with the patient and they don't know if the patient will ever wake up again. And I'm like, if you're discussing this with the patient and they can talk, maybe they just need high flow oxygen and not a tube.
I'll tell you, at the beginning though, and that's what I remember. I lost those arguments because I was really pissed off, because I was also part of the respiratory therapy committee, and they were just like, everyone was scared. They didn't want to use high-flow nasal cannula because they all imagined that it was just spewing virus, right? Because, 60 liters a minute in the nose, jetting in there, and they just felt like that was a huge infection risk. So they didn't want to use high-flow nasal cannulas. And I was like, and even BiPAP, non-invasive ventilation, they were also worried about that. But it took them a while to get over that. But I think people were harmed with those really conservative approaches and decisions. And that wasn't patient-centered. That was staff-centered. But I got to tell you, got to be a little forgiving, because we really didn't know what we were dealing with. And, I think there's a lot of fear, and I don't think we made the best decisions in that environment. But, little by slowly, I think we figured out how to take care of patients again, but lost our minds for a bit.
So tell us when you got involved or in the research around ivermectin use for treating patients. Can you walk us through sort of how you got into that and advocating?
Yeah. So basically, when I was starting to face off with these patients, I was actually kind of worried. If I got COVID, I didn't, I was a little overweight and I'm not otherwise healthy, but I put together a protocol for myself, really aggressive protocol. Actually, I had probably 6 or 8 things on there. And my ex-wife at the time, she was one of my ICU specialists. She was on my service. And so I wanted her to have the protocol I wanted to be treated with if I landed on a vent. So I'd already built the protocol. But then, I was really close with Paul Marek, who's world famous. He's the most published practicing ICU specialist in the history of my specialty. And he and I were close friends. And so we were discussing protocols. He was putting up a protocol on his website of his med school, which was getting attention. And then a couple of prominent docs said, hey, why don't you guys put together a group, call yourself something. We'll get a website. And you guys should put out your expert guidance, because we were really seasoned ICU specialists. And so we did that. We called ourselves the FLCCC Alliance. But part of that work was just immense study. We were just reading everything. We were talking to doctors in Italy and New York, even China. And we were just trying to come with the most expert evidence. And so we were putting together protocols. And we weren't really looking at early treatment. We didn't really have ivermectin on our minds. But then Paul did something clever. We almost had like a dashboard, and we had all these proposed treatments that people were saying worked. And we were just waiting for the evidence. And so when we thought the evidence kind of met a decent criteria, we'd give it like a green, and that would go on the protocol. And ivermectin was on there with a question mark through the spring and summer. And then in the fall, we started, Paul first identified the first few trials, like one out of Bangladesh, another one out of Miami, and I can't remember the third. And I mean, they were like really impressive. The one out of Miami was huge. I mean, it was like 70% reduction in mortality from out of Broward County. And so Paul even called, he said, this is the answer to the pandemic. And then we put out an early treatment protocol. So that was probably end of October 2020. And then I started working on a review paper. And it was so hard to write because literally every day a new trial would pop up on a preprint server, and my paper was the review of the emerging evidence of ivermectin, and put that together, and I submitted that for publication. And then Ron Johnson asked me to give testimony on early treatments in December 8th of 2020. And, had a little bit of a temper that day because the senator, I felt, was absolutely rude and offended me to no end. And so I kind of ripped into that topic, and it went viral and put ivermectin on the lips of a lot of people around the world. That video went viral in the States, but it hit a lot of other countries because my organization started getting requests for lectures and talks, from doctors groups and kind of little medical associations around the world. And that sent me on a whirlwind for the next few years, just still studying early treatments. I mean, our protocols, we had combination protocols. We had first line, second line, third line. I remember in Delta, I was using 4 and 5 drugs to get people through, to keep them out of the hospital. And so I still studied ivermectin, but, we were also studying lots of other things. And I worked really hard with the FLCCC. And I'm a teacher. That's what I've prided myself on as a medical educator. I've won the major departmental teaching awards at every institution I've been in. And it's funny, when we started the FLCCC, we really had you guys in mind. We had doctors as our audience. And it took us time to figure it out, like the doctors weren't listening to us. Even with the name of Marek, they just weren't listening. They were listening to protocols in their hospitals. But the lay people were listening. We suddenly had this huge public audience. And I will say that's when my kind of career and job changed. I do no longer educate doctors. I mean, my audience now is really lay people. And I teach them the facts about medicine. I mean, on my Substack, I definitely have doctors who really like me and follow me. Many of them are retired. I think we retired before medicine went crazy. They seem to be the most reasonable. They're like, yeah, of course you would do this. I'm totally with you, Dr. Kory. So I think you guys get it, So the days of the giants.
Yeah, but it's interesting. I'm absolutely horrified at protocol-driven medicine.
Yes.
And I mean, I used to sit on the parent board of 7 hospital system when we lived in Oregon. And, the CEO, who was a nurse, good guy, actually, was a tremendous manager, like no issues there. But he's like, okay, well, we have to be more like the airlines, with protocols and ticking boxes. And I looked at him and I said, here's the problem. The reason they do that for airlines is it's a machine that humans have developed, and the pilot can kill 275 people at one time. We can only kill one at a time. That didn't really go over well.
Or save one at a time.
Yeah, or save one at a time. And so the point, the point is that medicine is so wildly different. We try to mechanicalize it. We try to make it into these things. And yes, it's great to have a protocol to make sure you don't do surgery on the wrong knee and that you don't leave a sponge in a patient. But the ER, the ICU, even the outpatient world that I work in is not the same as repairing a car. It's not the same as flying an airplane. And we forget that.
I got to tell you, this is before COVID. My boss, because I was the chief, I mean, he would come to me and he would be like, there's just so much variability in how we practice. And, you need to start standardizing things. And I would be like, I just think to myself, I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to start telling. I had 17 ICU specialists on my service. I'm not going to start telling them they have to do the same thing. Like, we all have different, not only patients have an incredible variation, but so do doctors. We have different assessments of risk tolerance, different levels of expertise, different levels of aggressiveness and confidence. So you can't standardize the practice of medicine. You just let it be organic and natural. You just want to try to educate and share, right? So you want to have your knowledge and expertise to be shared with others so they can consider different options. But there's no, I'm with you, Tim. I was philosophically opposed to standardizing care in the ICU. But there are
always been
things
that
you
way.
can standardize, just not that. There's plenty of stuff that could be standardized and should be, like certain aspects of nursing care, maybe some aspects of medical care, but not the global care of a patient. No way.
That's true. I remember back to our ICU days a long time ago, and it would be we had 3, right? 3 or 4. 4 attendings.
Yeah, 3 were pulmonologists. 1 was a surgeon, which was interesting.
And
he did a fellowship in ICU.
Yeah.
That guy was aggressive.
But I'm thinking
surgeons are woo.
Right. And every time, so there I'd be on my rotation, and so it was usually like a 3 in a row, sometimes 4, 3.5, and I'd be doing on my rotation. It's like, okay, someone would come on for 3-4 days, and it's like, okay, I know what to expect with this guy, and then midway through, like a patient that's in the hospital, say they're in for a week, 2 weeks, then on comes the next attending. It's like, okay, now we're going to change everything, and even the nursing staff and all the support people and dietetics and pulmonary respiratory therapy. And us interns are like, okay, now we're just doing a 180, and now everything changed. But to your point that, yeah, there's the art as well as the science part of it and the nuances. So it is never been completely
and
standardized.
That way what's nice about that variability is the trainees, right? They get exposed to different ways of practice and different approaches, different levels of thoughtfulness or care. And I think a trainee is naturally drawn to that which they think is correct. And so, I think it's good to give those experiences and different approaches. And then you mix and match, right? Like the people who trained me, like I think I took the best from each of them in how they approach patients and how they cared for them.
Right. Well, and I'm thumbing through Instagram, and it obviously knows that I'm a doctor or something, and it pushes an ad for this AI, and there's a medical student sitting there, and she's like, "This is the greatest thing ever because it has all of the protocols for everything." So what we're doing, and I look at it and I go, you know what? I don't need to see you as a physician. Then just go do something else, do art or whatever it is. Because I would rather just see the AI then. If you're depending on a tool and not using your God-given common sense to treat me, then I don't want you. I just want the interface, actually, because it would probably be safer, and then I don't have to deal with them asking me all the idiotic questions like, do I feel safe at home, and do I masturbate with my right or left hand? And, like all this, like it's completely ridiculous what we've done. And the ACA did this to primary care, where you come in and everything is a protocol. The patient comes in with a hangnail, and we have to ask them how many beers they drink and all of these stupid questions to make so that we get our metrics, because the metrics are how you get paid. Yeah. And that was when I left primary care, because I realized, I thought a lot of that was actually immoral, because it's getting in between the sacred, the sacred bond between the doctor and the patient, and it's government or protocol-based medicine. And I was like, I'm done. I'll just go to urgent care where I can treat pneumonias and whatnot. Yeah. And
I want to ask them, are you thinking about this in the ICU?
What's that?
Sorry to interrupt, but I was thinking, I know people that are listening are going to want to know back, because the protocol-driven thing and how the systems reimburse physicians, what you're alluding to in primary care, that was the big thing, is hospitals are getting paid for people to be on ventilators, to be sicker, to have more complications. And it's kind of the conspiracy theory to the nth degree. But were you seeing that at the in the hospital, where they're like, we get more reimbursements from Medicaid, Medicare based on any push from above?
No, not while I was on the front lines during that period, because I'm not dealing with the finances. I don't know anything about I don't think I even learned that until I kind of left the system and I was reading, and that you learn about that on social media. You saw these incredible incentives to use remdesivir. What I saw was the other side, which is like, I thought using remdesivir was absurd on its face. And I never gave remdesivir to anyone. And when they came in on remdesivir, I stopped it because it was ridiculous. Because for one simple fact, which nobody knew, and we were trying to teach this, is that very early on there was a study where they were doing viral cultures on COVID patients, and you could not grow live virus. They couldn't get a live virus culture after day 6, and patients by the time they get to ICU was day 8 or 10. So why am I using a dangerous antiviral being infused, right? And actually, there is a trial of remdesivir as an outpatient, and it was actually quite positive. We know the one that made it standard of care overnight was a manipulated trial. They changed the outcome in the middle. The whole thing, and Fauci comes out, it's a game changer. They have a PR press conference in the Oval Office, for the drug companies. And like next thing you know, we're spending billions on remdesivir. And so that bothered me. I saw that and I would try to talk to the ID doctors about this. And I don't know. They just, thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. They had something to do and bill and, manage. So it just, it was disgusting.
But it was just I guess the thing that just got me, and again, we're country doctors, we're just very pragmatic, do what you, sewing up chainsaw wounds in the middle of Oregon. So, and just this, I started going down every single rabbit hole. I read my absolute ass off at the beginning of COVID and continue to do it. And I go, these guys are transgressing the just virology. Virology is not that this, what we know is, I'm sure just scratching the surface, but it's not that complicated. You never vaccinate with a leaky vaccine during a pandemic ever.
Yeah.
You always study the vaccine for a long, long time because you don't know the downstream consequences. You don't know if you're going to get, vaccine associated enhancement and all. I mean, I knew all about the first RSV vaccine from 1969, from the dengue fever, where they actually gave these vaccines and they seemed to work good and they built tons of antibodies, except they killed people.
Yep.
And, I was running around screaming this stuff at all my colleagues. I'm like, we gotta be super careful. We gotta be super careful. And then our red pill moment where we're working literally a shift together. And all these patients about 4 months after the vaccine came out start coming in with these super weird problems like POTS syndrome and myocarditis and red arm syndrome from getting a Moderna shot 5 weeks before. And we're like, well, clearly there's only one parameter that's changed. It's the vaccine.
America spends more on healthcare than any other country, yet we rank 48th in life expectancy. We spend trillions, but 200,000 insured people still declare medical bankruptcy every year. Clearly, the system is broken. But what if there was a way to take back control? To break free from inflated costs and red tape? That's exactly why Crowd Health was created, a smarter, more transparent way to pay for healthcare. No middleman, no bureaucracy. Just a community of people helping each other when it matters most. Join the revolution. Go to joincrowdhealth.com and use promo code BSFREE for a discount on your first 3 months. Because your health should be in your hands, not theirs.
And then they came out with all of this evidence that we had seen and said, okay, now we're going to vaccinate 6-month-olds who never die from this. They never transmit it, nothing. We are going to give only risk to an entire group of the most vulnerable people in the world that can get zero benefit from this. And I was like, okay, they're lying and they are full of shit and I'm done. I'm pulling myself out of the system.
Yeah. I had, it's funny so as you guys know, I mean, COVID transformed me as a physician, as a person. I mean, I am not that same person. When you talk about that red pill concept, I mean, I was as blue pilled as you could be. I mean, where I started, and I wrote about this in my book, I mean, I read the New York Times religiously since I was a child and believed that was the arbiter of truth. And, I had full trust in the New York Times. I venerated medical journals. I thought the top ones, only the best science and scientists published there, all that. But then, just stuff started to happen, almost like I told you, what my first experience is just on the ground, right? Just with my, local doctors, nobody was making sense, just commonsensically. But then when I started seeing what was coming out of institutions of authority, I was starting to get really concerned. So like my first aha moment was actually, I think April of 2020. I remember I was in the car listening to NPR.
Oh, you were really blue pill.
I promise you, that's where I started.
Was it the sweaty balls segment though?
No, not that one. But I was listening to NPR, and the radio announces that I can't remember which agency was restricting hydroxychloroquine to hospitalized patients only. Now, I didn't believe hydroxychloroquine worked at that time. I didn't think there was evidence. I wasn't sure it was working as an antiviral. I was underwhelmed with it, and I wasn't doing early treatment. But I remember thinking, like, wait a second. If it's going to work as an antiviral, you give it the first few days of the illness. I mean, what are you giving it in the hospital for? And I remember like almost screaming at the radio, like, you morons, what are you doing? So I started thinking these policies were stupid, that it was stupidity driving them, right? And then as we get more red-pilled over my journey, I realized it wasn't. And then the second supposedly stupid thing, this is the last time I thought it was stupidity, but it was when the vaccines came out, and I had colleagues who were in primary care. They had, primary care practices, and they would just naturally check antibodies before offering the vaccine to someone, right? Like, why would you vaccinate someone who just had COVID, right? And the FDA puts a sign up on their website saying that there's no evidence to support that practice of checking antibodies before giving a vaccine. What do you mean there's no evidence? That's never been in practice. And so when they disappeared natural immunity overnight from the FDA, and it was so clear why they were doing that. And then my second realization is that this is about money, and it's totally corrupt. And I've actually now progressed to higher levels of awareness of what was really going on. It's not just the money. But at the time, the easiest that everyone can understand is financial influences. But I was like, of course, if they don't give a vaccine to everyone with antibodies, the market for the vaccine shrinks dramatically. So I was like, literally, they are just making up these rules so that they can keep the market size for those vaccines as massive as possible, because it was not medically, it was totally devoid from science and what we know about immunology and everything. And that got me. After that, I realized that this is all bad news. Whatever they're doing, they are directly in the service of the pharmaceutical industry, 100%, full stop, end of story. And then I never listened to them again. Ever.
Well, and that's what, my buddy, good friend of mine, he's about 10 years older than me. And he was asking me about the vaccine or whatever. And we actually got it the initial Pfizer, because we didn't know what we didn't know.
Yep.
And after talking to Sasha Latapova, we probably got no vaccine because we had zero effects. So we're pretty happy about that. But anyways, my buddy goes to the local doc. This is a doc I know. She's, I think, very competent, et cetera, et cetera. And she's like, well, the vaccine gives you better immunity than getting the infection, because he had just had COVID. And I looked at him and I go, she's just contradicting, the last 200 years of, virology and bacteriology. Yeah. It's like, no. Natural immunity, no matter what it is, by definition has to be better because you're getting infected with the whole freaking virus, not just the damn spike protein. And I'm like, what happened to physicians that somehow Lord Fauci or the CDC or the FDA says something and we just take it as, yep, that's it. That's gospel. It's in the Bible. It must be true. And I'm like, it's just not.
So you saw those things. And so because we're talking about I'm talking about kind of my journey to journey of awakening, I guess, and realization. So the first step is that they're working in the service of the pharmaceutical industry, right? And then the second is obviously the science, devoid of science. But then when I learn, and this is where it starts to get scary, what I start to learn now is that after my ivermectin testimony, things started to go sideways for me pretty quickly. I always say, I didn't expect a ticker tape parade, for me and Paul and the group identifying ivermectin as a really soundly evidence-based therapeutic. But I didn't expect what was going to happen next. Like within a day of that testimony, the Associated Press sent a reporter. And we were all excited in the FLCCC. We were finally going to have a national voice. We're going to get our message out there, because up until that time, we were always trying to talk to reporters to try to bring knowledge of our protocols out there. But it was almost like a blockade in the media. Like they will not talk about an approach to treatment without a randomized controlled trial. Like almost like call us back when you have a randomized controlled trial with your nice little protocol, right? You know, which also has disappeared medicine, right? This whole hegemony and obsession with randomized controlled trials. But, you know, I lost my second job after that testimony because they didn't want me to speak publicly again. And I said, I will not. They immediately offered me a new contract because my old contract didn't have any, you know, mouth gag. So they wanted to keep me employed, but just gag me. And I was like, nah, I'm out. And so I wasn't working clinically when the vaccines came out. So that's the only reason why I escaped, because I had no concerns about vaccines before. Like, had I been working, I would have gotten the shot. Paul Marik got the shot, you know, go down to employee health, you got to get it or whatever. And people went and got it. I probably would have gotten, because I wasn't that studied on them. But then the Associated Press writes this hit job. And we actually filed an ethics complaint against the Associated Press because it was just basically presenting ivermectin as another drug to debunk like hydroxychloroquine. Meanwhile, I had spent 20 minutes with this reporter burying her in the data. And like I knew it worked, not only from the data, but I had talked to doctors around the world. I knew stuff was happening in Peru, like in the places in Peru that were taking ivermectin, nobody was getting sick. You know, those that got sick were getting better really quickly. And you heard it from everywhere. If you were connected and asking questions. And so AP does a hit job. And then my paper, which is at a pretty prominent journal, it passed 3 rounds of rigorous peer review with high-level scientists. The editor of that journal issue was actually Robert Malone. He's the one who proposed the issue, which was an issue on repurposed drugs for COVID. And so it gets accepted for publication. We pay the open access fee. It's an online journal. And it's now late January 21, and week after week after week goes by, and they're not publishing the paper. And, you know, I'm again scratching my head. And then I started to say, you know, there's something that smells here. And so I wrote an email to the journal representative, and I said, I'm going public with accusations of scientific misconduct unless you answer me why this paper, which has passed peer review and been accepted, is not being published. And within a day, the head editor of all the journals, it was a Frontiers collection, basically talked to Robert, and they basically said that they got an anonymous third-party reviewer who disagreed with my conclusion and was telling them to retract. And that day was a big one for me. Like, I knew the fix was in. I knew there was something big and bad out there that was pushing back. And I'll never forget that day. And I got to tell you, the day that I learned that, I was so and I'm not a guy who's very emotional. I don't get that upset. I don't get sad, but I was like really freaked out. And the reason why is because when Robert talked to the editor, you know, we were wondering, like, why can't we just revise it, right? Typically, if you have a peer reviewer who objects to your paper, you make the revisions to satisfy them. And his answer was, we're not working with them, not with their behavior. Meaning, like, my kind of, it wasn't a crazy unprofessional email, but it was, you know, a little bit, contrarian, I guess, or, you know, it stirred up some conflict. And I thought my behavior in that email is what sunk the paper ultimately. And I thought it was my responsibility and my behavior which prevented that paper from reaching publication. And I will tell you, it didn't last very long, because within 2 days, I came to the very sound conclusion that paper was never getting published, period. It had nothing to do with my stupid email. But, you know, imagine what I almost felt like. I don't want to overstate it, over dramatic, like the weight of the world. Because do you remember the death curves in that 2020, 2021 winter? I mean, they were massive. I mean, obviously, I know they were inflated, but we had the most deaths, and the ICUs were full in a lot of cities. And like, we needed ivermectin out there. And that, when that paper got pulled, then that's kind of my point, guys, is like I started to see how big and how coordinated it was. And then the next realization is the journals. The top journals in the world publishing these large, high quality, rigorous trials of ivermectin that were so brazenly manipulated. I mean, they were literally obviously fraudulent trials. If you really look, you have to look a little bit below the surface. If you look at the protocols, the protocol visions, and how they were designing them, how they were conducting them, they weren't excluding people on ivermectin. They were giving like the tiniest doses of ivermectin for the short amount of time and the healthiest people. And then they would look at mortality. They just did all this crazy stuff. And these papers were sailing to publication in the top journals of the world. Every time one got published, massive media campaigns going out there. New York Times, Boston Globe, ivermectin found ineffective in latest, large quality, high quality, rigorous trial. And I'm watching this stuff and I'm just like, what is going on? They got the journals. So I already knew they had the agencies. Now they have the journals. And I'm like, they have the media too. And so that's when I got to the point, like, this is total control, global coordination. And then if you want to fast forward, just a massive psyop. I mean, this was information warfare. And they were targeting, they're in my most generous moods. I look upon most of my colleagues that are still in that system and behave the way they did and the way they behaved. Many of them behave towards the unvaccinated, the remdesivir, pushing on everyone and all that stuff. But in my most generous moods, I think they were the most targeted with the propaganda and censorship. I mean, they went after those doctors because doctors were getting it from everywhere, right? From the institutions, the journals, the agencies, and once you had the doctors, completely zombified and just doing all these things, it was all lost. But anyway, that's a little bit of my journey.
Yeah, well, we get asked that all the time.
No, like I'm a big picture guy. Like I used to skydive, and I loved looking out of the door of the airplane and going,
literally a big picture guy.
literally. And you sit there, and it's like people freaking out. Take for instance this, the Maha stuff that's going on now, and people are freaking out about well, what if we change this or that with food or whatever, or what if people don't, stop taking some of these chronic medications, what's going to happen? And I'm like, well, it's not working what we're doing now. I mean, if what the drug companies advertise actually worked, we'd all be super smart, super happy, BMIs of 16 with, using our injectable Xiaflex for absolutely perfectly straight penises. Like right. Everything would be fine. It's not. Instead, we're dumber, sadder, and fatter than we've ever been. We're more chronically ill. We're more depressed. If I gave a talk, this is years and years ago, about how useless most of what we do is in medicine, at least in primary care. And the only person that was really honest was one of the psychiatrists. He came up to me and he goes, "You know what? You're right." He goes, "I've been doing this for 20 years. We have all of these new meds. I'm seeing the same patients I saw for 20 years.
Yep.
Because they never get better." And I said, yep. Exactly. Exactly. And so if it's not working, why do we keep doing it? It's like doctors are so, I swear medical school makes people dumber, or at least less wise, because you're just indoctrinated into a way of thinking that is really ultimately dangerous.
Yeah. And, what I've, so like you just brought up another point, right? So then, because I want to go back to what I was doing. So when I left my second job, I worked full time for the FLCCC, and that organization became quite successful. We had an outpouring of support. We had some nice large donations. We were growing as a team. We had PR, and we're again, educating, messaging the public, putting out our protocols, talking about them. I was traveling kind of around the world, speaking at all these places. And then I kind of got, I got the itch. I wanted to go back. I'm a doctor. I like doctoring. And so I became an independent contractor, and I started working at hospitals around the country. And then I landed at a more permanent contractor job in Wisconsin. And, the CMO was trying to get rid of me, but my partners who hired me, they loved me because I taught them so much about COVID, my protocols, and they actually knew of me because you guys may or may not know this, but I was fairly well known in my specialty before COVID because I was like a pioneer in critical care ultrasonography, and my textbook was like really like a best-selling textbook in like 7 languages, and I traveled around the country teaching people that for years, and so I was a fairly well-known guy. They loved having me there. And when the CMO was sending them like these propaganda hit pieces on me, he was like, get rid of Kory. And they were like, if Kory goes, we go. And they protected me in my job. And I loved that job. I really loved that job. The nurses loved me. I was running that ICU. And then suddenly in November of 2021, they just they managed to convince my partners that I was telling people not to get vaccinated, and which is a complete fabrication because when they said I said it, I know I didn't say it. And they came up, and you guys know what a sham peer review is, right? It's how they get rid of doctors they want to get rid of, right? They just make up employee complaints, HR complaints, and then they have a file on you. But I was an independent contractor, so it was really simple. Like I remember I woke up after a long weekend working, and the ICU director calls me, and he and I were good friends, and he was like, Pierre, he's like, I'm sorry, man, we don't need you anymore. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, we got reports that you told a patient in the ER, that the vaccine was dangerous and to not get vaccinated. And I was like, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. And then he's like, really? You didn't say it? And I said, no. And he's like, well, let me call you back. So then he hangs up, calls me back 5 minutes later. He's like, yeah, Pierre, I'm sorry. It's just not going to work. And then the last thing he said to me is he said, Pierre, this is a war and you're a casualty. And I said, maybe when this war is over, if you guys still need someone, maybe I'll come back. That's never going to happen. I'm done. But so then I basically became unemployable, right? There's no way I was going to get a job anymore. And I was just kind of done. And so then I went back to FLC, and then I went into private practice. But what I'm trying to get to, Tim, is like what you were saying is like how ineffective a lot of what allopathy does. And I figured out why. Because now I'm in private practice. I have full autonomy. And I very slowly, it's taken me 3 years. I've been in private practice now for 3 years, but I've gone down rabbit holes on all sorts of approaches and treatments and therapies, right, that don't have randomized controlled trials around them, right? Because they cannot have randomized controlled trials. No, not big RCTs anyway. No one's going to fund those. But you find that there's dozens of really effective therapies that treat illness that are safer and easier and cheaper and more available, and even that promote health that will never show up in textbooks, never be in any curriculums, and never get on any guidelines for treatment. And so, what I used to think of alternative medicine. So when I was in that system, I mean, I'm going to guess that if you had told me like about hyperbaric oxygen, like when I was an allopath, I'd be like, yeah, whatever, that's hokey stuff. Or, like all the stuff that I'm like using and employing in my patients now, like I would have laughed at that years ago. And, but I find I'm so inspired now because everything I'm doing is repurposing, and I'm very careful. I use generally safe therapies that have been around, that are well known, so they don't really have risks. They oftentimes are inexpensive, and I'm finding a high efficacy of various things. And I don't need a trial or a study to tell me something works. We know that what medicine was built on for 1,000 years. It's observation. It's keen observation. It's noticing patterns of disease and how those trajectories change, and like this whole like obsession that the doctor doesn't know how to treat something unless there's a randomized controlled trial to prove it. And then I came to the realization that the only thing controlled about a randomized controlled trial is the outcome.
Absolutely.
Right. Just like you used to always say things like, you don't have a randomized controlled trial for appendicitis rupture or a gunshot wound to the head. I mean,
yeah, I got it. I should have taken this guy on more, but it was on Facebook, and this guy was like, we shouldn't be doing anything without an RCT to tell us to do it. And I was like, you're a neurosurgeon. There's not a single blinded study on whether you trephine somebody's head to let the blood clot out so that they don't, cone and die. It's called common frickin' sense. It's surgery. You can't do an RCT for surgery. What you're going to do, a fake carotid end arterectomy on half the patients and a real one on the other. I mean, I was like, you're such a dipshit. You can't even see that you're a dipshit. Like that's what it made me so crazy. And then the other thing is these RCTs use what I think is the most egregious lying in the history of mankind, which is relative risk difference.
Yep.
Relative risk is literally legalized lying. It's worse than, all of the pharmaceutical advertisements combined. This idea that you can have a 40% relative risk and a 0.001 absolute risk difference, and they don't have to tell you that in the ad or when the drug detail person comes to sell you their drug, is insane. I mean, that relative risk of 30% difference in breast cancer wiped out hormone treatment for women. How many more women would have not had heart attacks, would have delayed Alzheimer's, would have actually, been sexually active into their 70s and 80s if it wasn't for these dumbasses that did the Nurses Health Study and said there's a 30%. There was like no difference.
So can I tell you what my biggest pet peeve about, let's call it evidence-based medicine, is that it's effectively built on a lie. The idea that a randomized controlled trial somehow brings a more accurate conclusion than what's called a retrospective observational control trial is simply not true. And the Cochrane Library did this. I think it's the most important paper in medicine. It was published in 2016 by a guy named Engelmeyer, where they looked at all these disease models. They looked at they combined all the randomized controlled trials and all the retrospective observational control trials. And they said, what did they find? Like, was it on average, was there a disagreement between their findings? There was no disagreement. They always, almost like the 99th degree, generally reach the same conclusion, especially if you had a collection of those trials. And in that paper, they said that when there's a difference between an observational and a randomized, you must look for the reason why outside of the trial design. And the way I read that then, I didn't really know what that meant, but the way I read it now is I actually think they're saying someone is monkeying with one of those trials. And if I had to guess who's monkeying, it's the one where all the money is involved, right? And now I realize that, manipulating randomized controlled trials is like literally a practice, right? And you guys are aware of those famous quotes by editors of the top journals in the world, where they, like Marsha Angel, she said over 50% of published research findings are false. And then I realized these journals are just absolutely unreliable, and it's gotten so bad. Like I don't think I could trust a big trial when there's money on the line and they publish the New England Journal on some new fancy med for some disease. I can't believe it. I won't believe it. There's too much money in it, and they lie. They manipulate and lie. And I saw the line they did with ivermectin, right, to prop up that whole disinformation campaign. And so, I'm just disgusted. Now I use medicines that don't need randomized controlled trials. I'm out here inventing, trying, practicing and learning. It's a really, I'm having more fun, more inspired and satisfied doctoring now than I ever have, for sure.
Oh, that's awesome. That's good, because I'm not. I need to divorce myself, I think, entirely from the system.
And I did.
Yeah, it's just. Yeah, it really is. Like the stuff that we use every day. It's been a really bad flu season. It's kind of, I think, obvious why it's a bad flu season. You shut everybody in, down for the better part of 2 years, and then you give them all of these poisons that are supposed to be helpful but are just poisoning their immune system, and then you wonder why everyone gets sick. And then they come in and they everybody wants Tamiflu, and I'm like, well, it works for maybe if you're at day one it might shorten the illness by 12 hours, but it probably doesn't do much. I don't care, we got to do something. I'm going on a cruise.
Tamiflu is actually a fraud. It's a fraud. That's also a manipulated trial. It effectively is a fever reducer. And by the way, the one thing that the government said was I don't know if they actually officially had it in a protocol, but in COVID, I think at one point they said, Tylenol for fever or something. Do you know, out of all of the therapies we used, there was only one that actually had a statistically significant increase in mortality, and that was Tylenol. And it wasn't because of toxicity. It's because you're not supposed to suppress a fever. And that's like the biggest myth in medicine, right? And I learned that in the ICU. I was taught that. I wouldn't treat fevers under 104. Maybe 105. I might try to cool someone down a little bit, but generally I'd let the fevers roll. But everyone's always treating fevers, and you saw it killed people. I mean, the data shows that more people, the more Tylenol you took, or if you took Tylenol, you would do worse. So,
which is interesting because there's only two explanations for a fever. It's adaptive or it's maladaptive. That's it. So humans have been around for a long time, and we still get fevers, and kids get fevers like, the sun is setting, I'm getting a fever. Yeah. So I would think that that's probably adaptive and not maladaptive. And common sense would tell you if fevers have existed for this long, they probably have a good purpose, not a bad purpose.
Yeah.
Just like inflammation, right? Like, you twist your knee swells up, right? It's trying to heal itself. And now we have, PRP, where you increase inflammation and then people get better. Instead, what we were doing is we're jabbing steroids into everything.
Putting ice all over it, for sure. Yeah.
So it's just, again, common sense. It comes back, and you mentioned philosophy. It comes back to philosophy. And if you have bad philosophy, you make bad decisions. I mean, and that's really the case. And the problem I have with allopathic medicine is, we're broken, you need to be fixed, and we can fix you. Well, I love what Brent Weinstein said. I think he was, I can't remember which podcast he was on, where he said, we assume because a phone is complicated, we can fix it because we built it, we understand it. We assume that the human body or biology is the same as a complicated phone. And he said it's not. It's complex. So you change one thing in your biology, and you don't know what's going to happen downstream with God knows how many other systems. And that's really the problem. And what I use as an example often is acid suppression. So, you walk down the, non-ulcer dyspepsia GERD pathway, and we used to do surgery for that, vagotomies, pyeloroplasties for ulcers, and then Tagamet came along. We'll just suppress the acid, and then Prilosec, we'll just wipe the acid out. But no one sat there and said, well, human beings have been making hydrochloric acid as a digestive, enzyme or aid or whatever for the last 19 bazillion years. Maybe it's important.
Yeah. And
then you realize, you can't make nitric oxide. You have increased risk of heart disease and all of these other downstream things. After we've written 1,900,000 gazillion prescriptions for Prilosec. I mean, it took decades to start to figure out that maybe this is a bad idea. And again, bad philosophy makes bad decisions. You're broken. You just have too much acid. We can fix that one thing and you'll be fine. It's just completely insane.
And they don't look for the downstream effects, right? They do these trials, little short follow-up, and then it's safe, it works, people feel a little bit better, and then they stay on these medicines for years, and then you see all sorts of issues that get buried, And so, I think a lot of the stuff we do you're right. Philosophically, doesn't make sense to try to change the body's natural defenses against things, and then we do it rather recklessly as well.
And I'm sure in your specialty you would have seen this, practiced it, and agree that we've compartmentalized medicine so much, specialized and hyper specialized, that everyone's focused on their niche and forgetting the whole body. And sometimes I would think back to people that I knew that were practicing alternative, as we call it, medicine, Chinese medicine, when they look at the whole picture, the big picture of how all these systems interact. And you think of the immune system and endocrinology that does that, but you forget you can't just isolate the cardiovascular system in a box without it impacting the respiratory system, or maybe the how it's affecting the kidney. I mean,
right.
But we could go into that for hours.
I know, right?
I just tell you, you guys and me, we could probably go for 5 hours.
Right.
One of my closest friends, he's older than me. He's 18 years older than me. He was the best man at my wedding years ago, and best friend, and he's got some issues right now. And he went into the hospital a month ago with he was short of breath with an arrhythmia. He felt really weak. And this is back in New York. And I'm checking in on him. He goes in. He's got a weak heart. His EF is down. But they focus on the arrhythmia. So like day one, he gets an ablation. So electrophysiologic intervention, ablation. Day two, because of the arrhythmia, they do a cath. And he's had so many catheterizations. I'm like, John, your coronaries are always clean. Why are they doing that again? You know, he has a clean cath. Then, because his EF is whatever, 39%, they're like, oh, you need a defibrillator. But by the second day, they're talking about a defibrillator. And you know what? His hemoglobin, when he came in, was like 7.8, and then it starts dropping, and then they start dumping blood into him. He was having a GI bleed. And so I'm sitting here, you know, down in Florida, like they did an ablation, a catheterization, and they're trying to put a defibrillator in him when he's having a GI bleed. You know, it's because the cardiologists are like looking with these blinders on, and no one's looking. It was absolutely just, and that's my friend, man. And he ended up spending a month in the hospital for a bunch of issues, and it was just, that's what I'm saying. We could go crazy.
Holy crap. I'm thinking, what happened to like remember the day we'd go, you get all the hyper consults from internal medicine to do the blanket overview, just makes like, does that not exist anymore?
Well, no, but the one that absolutely gets me, and again, we need to go out for drinks because this you know, we'll probably shut the place down, but it's so ridiculous. So, you know, I do a lot of work down in Venice. There's a lot of, you know, older people down there, and I swear, if you go into Baskin Robbins, they put, you know, blood thinner, like Eliquis sprinkles on your ice cream because they all eat shit playing pickleball and they're all on blood thinners. So I had a conversation with a cardiologist, actually a fairly renowned one. And I said, okay, I think you guys still win if the patient dies of a cerebral hemorrhage and not a heart attack. I think that's how it works because you got these 85-year-olds with walkers on freaking blood thinners, and they always fall down and they always bleed. And it's, you know, well, it doesn't matter. It's a standard of care. And I said, what do you mean it doesn't matter? He said, nowhere in the standard of care, which you are going to be held liable for if someone sues you, does it talk about fall risk. It's just CHAD score equals blood thinner, no other gestalt. No other, you know, the guy has 2 club feet, a walker, a crutch, and is blind in one eye. Like none of that matters. And I go, okay, we are living in a simulation if that's the case.
Yeah.
Wow. So you're right. We could talk forever, but we want to be respectful of your time here with us. We're so happy that you're now, I hope, living your best medical career life, despite some of the good times that you did have in the ICU in the old days. Is there a place where if someone wants to seek you out that they can find you, get in touch with you, other than finding your Substacks?
Yeah,
how would they do that?
For sure. So I specialize in treatment of long COVID and long vax, so the post-vaccination syndrome and long COVID syndromes. I also do complementary cancer care where we use combinations of repurposed medicines to treat cancer. That's been really exciting. And that's at drpierrekory.com. So PIERREKORY. And then if people want to read more, I do a lot of writing. I have a Substack called Pierre Kory Medical Musings. And I write about a lot of different topics that I'm learning about, my experiences, insights, and people seem to like it. And I enjoy it. I'm turning myself into a little bit of a writer, and it's a fun part of what I do.
Outstanding.
That's wonderful. I have to ask a couple of kind of fun questions, if that's okay. We like to throw this in for a bit of personalized stuff at the end. So what would be a book or resource you'd recommend on alternative treatments?
Oh, boy. Got it right here.
Uh-huh.
MMS Health Recovery Guidebook.
Ah.
No household should be without it. That's what I think.
All right. Wonderful. Well, how about favorite book or novel that's not medical?
There's one and one only, and it's Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. The 900-page novel that I read in my 20s, I read it 3 times. It was my favorite book of all time.
I don't know that one. Do you?
No.
Okay.
No, and if it's so it's up there with Atlas Shrugged, which is, I don't know, what is it, 425,000 words. I mean, it's just
there you go.
How about your personal go-to for handling stress?
Embarrassed to admit it. It's what he wanted to do later.
Okay. Birds of a feather, baby.
Well, let me sound a little bit better than that. I would say my latest trick is actually going to bed early. There's something about I've discovered that when I go to bed early, I wake up really early, and I love those early morning hours, and I tend to be more productive, and that day goes better. So that's my latest. What do they call everything now? Biohacks.
There you go.
That's my latest biohack.
Gary Brecka biohack.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's another whole rabbit hole that absolutely drives me completely insane.
Exactly.
But I've written about that too, so that's funny. We can share. Anyways, well, thank you so much for your time. We'll do this later. We will definitely keep in touch. It's fun that
reach out, guys.
We're neighbors now. So,
and
absolutely.
If I'm in your neighborhood, I'll make sure to reach out. So nice chatting, guys.
Well, that was fun. What a normal, down to earth guy, and just. It's exactly the same experience that we had, but we're, on the outpatient side, he's on the inpatient side. And all of a sudden you just start seeing the world in a completely different way. And that was really fun to hear that and I found it very encouraging ultimately. I
loved actually getting to hear his story, his perspective as it kind of played out in time. Because we'd heard snippets of it before, as well as read all kinds of things. And, really what hit home for me is what we always know. It's the whole medicine science really isn't about consensus protocols, taking advice from anyone in financial incentivized things, but really it's about questioning, challenging, digging for the truth, putting together individuals around the country, the world that are going through it in real time, that are clinicians on the front lines, and shared experiences. That's how you'd advance medicine, right? So,
right. But I'm scared shitless that we're producing the helicopter generation of physicians where everyone got a trophy. And, we saw this before we left academic medicine with like how so many of the young physicians we're training have no confidence, like zero. Like you don't want to be arrogant. You don't want to think you know things that you don't know. Like you have to have a level of, uncertainty and, dealing with that discomfort. But you also have to be confident and say, look, I'm making this decision because I think it's the right thing to do. I'm going to talk to the patient about it, et cetera, et cetera. And we'd have people, it's just like this protocol driven stuff. I cannot speak more intensely about how it's going to destroy the doctor-patient relationship, and it's going to destroy medicine, patients. And it's going to hurt people.
Yeah,
because it's not one size fits all.
No, heck, we're seeing it in real time now, even in physicians that are even our age that are following these protocols. And I'm seeing it on some of the forums that I'm on, dealing with even hormonal issues, where it's like, oh, your lipids just rose because you're in menopause and your LDL is going up. Oh, that means you need a statin. Everybody needs a statin. As soon as the numbers go up, just treat the numbers. Don't treat the patient. Don't look for the whole issue, the whole cause, look at the whole patient. Very frightening. I think we're going to have to seek out older docs that are still
just
practicing.
Chinese medicine. That's what I'm going to do.
There you go. Anyways,
going to get my chi
we could
massaged.
go on forever. So if you found this episode inspiring, made you yell in your car like Tim often does, usually it's other drivers, but yell in excitement or pull over to Google something, look it up. We want to hear from you. Shoot us a message on social media, drop us an email, leave us a review. Seriously, we like to read them all, especially the spicy ones. And if you want to check out more of Dr. Kory's work, we've got the links in the show notes to his website, FLCCC resources, but his Substack and more. So check those out, because informed decision starts with informed and educated minds, taking health into your own hands. So before you got that, go hit the subscribe and follow button, please, in the podcast player you're listening to. We've got more great guests every week coming up. More fun Doctales with Cocktails, which is our loosey-goosey Tim Gets Crazy episode. So don't miss those as well. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and as always, stay BS free. See you next time.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD. to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS3MD. See you next time.
While we try to keep BS3MD as raw and real as possible, we can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bs3md.com.